All right, so we were at chapter 11, so we're going to pick up right where we left off in chapter 11. Remember chapters 1 and 2, the superiority of the Son of God. And then chapters 3 and 4, the superiority of the Son of God's faithfulness. And chapters 5 and 6, the superiority of the Son of God's work. And then chapters 7 through 10, the superiority of the Son of God's priesthood. And that's the things to know. So we need to know chapters 1 through 10. We need to know this. This kind of goes along with the layout how Romans is done. And then we go to chapters 11 through 13. And these are things to do. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, of course, we was in chapter 11 here, chapter 11. This is the faith chapter. And we briefly went through faith before the flood, which was verses 1 through 7. The faith of the patriarchs, which is verses 8 through 22. The faith of Moses and Joshua's time, which was verses 23 through 31. And verses 32 to 40. And that's where we left off to where we are going to start off with is that today. So just briefly in the chapter, we're going to just briefly look at the chapter real quick before we go to 32 to 40. 1 to 3. Faith means conviction, trust, faithfulness. And faith, this is referring to faith that endures. Faith that goes to work. That's what it is. In Hebrews 11:27, it says, by faith he, which is Moses, forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And then Paul said in Galatians 3:11, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Living by faith, and what people think that says and what Paul means by what it says, people seem to view it different. Living by faith means it's your life. You walk it, you talk it, that's living by faith. It becomes you. Your faith, it has everything to do with everything you think, say, and do. Your faith is involved in that. And of course, verse 4 was Abel. Action of faith. It's at work. And it was counted to him, his faith was counted to him for righteousness because it was a working faith. It was a faith. Now, when we get to James, we're going to see that we'll see that a little bit more clear how that works. Enoch, in verses 5 to 6, walked pleasing to God. And you can only please God is by faith. And he was translated from the world to heavenly. And that's an illustration for every believer. We start walking by faith. What are we? We're translated from this world, living in this world, in our walk, into a heavenly walk. That's the idea. The believer is supposed to be moving closer to that heavenly walk. And in Noah, verse 7, faith that obeys God. So it's a faith that obeys. Then you had the patriarchs, 18 to 22, verses 8 to 10. Abraham obeyed not knowing where he was going. See, faith obeys God without saying, okay, God, you got to give me all the reasons why you want me to do this. I got to have all the details first before I'm going to do that. Faith doesn't operate that way. Faith operates, if God said it, you do it. You just do what he says. And you're not looking for explanations. And then verses 11 to 12, Sarah, by faith, received strength to do God's will. You see, so anything that we need in order to perform God's will, God provides for that. He doesn't ask us to do something that we're not able to do. And then verses 13 to 16 is like a parenthesis in there. Faith continues even while waiting for the promise. So faith continues even while waiting for the promise. And that's what we're doing. Are we not waiting for the promise? Yes. And faith should be operating. Then it goes into verses 7 to 8 to 19. By faith, Abraham sacrificed the most important thing to him in this world, and that was Isaac. And he sacrificed that to God. That's what faith does. Faith puts God above everything. And then verses 20 to 22, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Faith that looks forward to the promises of God. Faith is looking forward. Then we had 23 to 31 was the faith of Moses and Joshua. We have in verse 23 Moses' parents, and they placed God above Pharaoh. So are we placing God above the government? What the government says, do we obey God first? In verses 24 to 29, Moses by faith turned from the world, endured, kept the Passover, passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. So they walked on solid ground. And are we supposed to be walking on the sand or on the rock? Solid ground. See, how are we walking? And in verse 30, the fall of Jericho, obeyed God patiently. Are we patiently obeying God? And then Rahab, by faith, separated herself from the unbelievers. And she did that before the walls came down. And that's important to get that. She separated herself from the unbelievers before the wall came down. Not when the wall came down, but before the wall came down. Are we separating ourselves from unbelievers? So now we come to verses 32 through 40. And that is where in we'll look at verse 32. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. So if he went through and started dealing with each one of those, just like he already was doing, he was hitting individuals and showing the walk of his faith. He said the time, the time would fail him to be able to do that. So when we look at this, first, saving faith is not a vain faith, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:2. And it's not a dead faith, which James says in James 2:26. So we're going to get to that in James chapter 2 on that. So Paul says it's a vain faith won't save you, and James says dead faith won't save you. So that's the idea. Saving faith is a faith that endures and bears fruit. It has fruit, which is the works. The fruit is the works. That's what Bible faith is. Now looking into these, I just broke them down. Now I'm not going to go into all of them, but it's just something to think about. So he starts out and says, who through faith, verse 33, subdued kingdoms. Now you can look at references and you can look back in the Old Testament where this has happened. And so I put reference on some of them. I just put reference on some of them because I think you can connect with them. Because we have Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and David where they conquered kingdoms. They subdued them. We also have worked righteousness. I put 2 Samuel 8:15 on that as one of them. That how David did justice and righteous in the kingdom, and how he did. So that worked righteousness. And you can look at that in more detailed ways, in different ways to look at that. The third thing is obtain promises. So when God would give a promise, just like with Abraham, I put Hebrews 6:15 on that. Abraham received the promise. What? God said, I'm going to give you a son. And he did, Isaac. So he obtained promises. So if God gives us a promise while we're walking on this earth, he's going to perform whatever it is he promised to us. Stop the mouths of lions. And you can look at that however you want to look at that and what that means. We have also in verse 34, quench the violence of fire. And you can look at some things in the Old Testament that make reference to that as well. Escape the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. Number 8, became valiant. I keep saying the wrong word. It's valiant, which is strong, mighty, powerful, sure in battle. So you become valiant in battle. Number 9, turn to flight the armies of the aliens or the enemies. So you're able to cause the enemies to turn away. And you can look at these in a spiritual manner as well, because we have the spiritual enemies that are working as well. And then 10, women receive their dead raised from life again. And that's in verse 35. Now in verse 35, it changes. You have this, and now we're going to the other part, the suffering part. So these are all the conquering things. So there's about 10 things there. It's all on how you go about what this is, number 1, number 2, whatever, however you do that. But I looked at about 10 of them that's there. But also in verse 35 it says, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Now, why would, we could look and we could spend a lot of time on these. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. Well, how would they accept deliverance? Well, you would have to give in. Giving in would be accepting deliverance, but they didn't. So it's all on how you kind of look at what's happening. The second thing, still others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, and chains and imprisonments. So that happened in the Old, and these things happen in the New Testament as well. Verse 37, the third thing is they were stoned. A lot of stoning took place in the Old Testament, and it happened in the New Testament as well. What did they do with Stephen? They stoned him. They were sawn in two. That's the fourth one, which I think it was Isaiah, is where it was thought that Isaiah was cut into. I may have that wrong, though. I may have that wrong. The fifth were tempted. So that kind of goes with that first one. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they may attain a better resurrection. So there's the temptation. There's a temptation, and I think on that Joseph, a temptation with Joseph, and what did he do? He refused the temptation, and of course it caused him to go to prison because of that. The sixth one were slain with the sword. 7, they wandered about in sheepskins and goat skins. In other words, they're not wearing the best clothing. Being destitute, afflicted, tormented. And then the 9th is, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and dens and caves of the earth. So you kind of see the idea of what he's bringing. This, believers, there's a conquering part in our lives, but there's also the suffering. And we can see that. There's times that we're overcomers, and we're overcoming things that the Lord has us to do, and we overcome, but then there's times that we're going to suffer. And it's both of these that helps strengthen us. We need both of these to help us along, and they help us to grow even stronger and to trust the Lord. So the Lord knows when we need to overcome versus when it's time to suffer. And all of us will go through conquering times and also times of suffering. Every believer is going to go through that. And then verses 39 to 40. And this is the BBE translation. Be not one of, and not one of these got the good things of the agreement, though they all had a good record through faith, because God had kept some better things for us, so that it was not possible for them to become complete without us. So when's that going to happen? At the second coming. When Jesus comes again, this is when this is going to happen. That's when the resurrection takes place, and the Old Testament believers and the New Testament believers will be resurrected at the same time. They're believers just like we are. We're in the same body that they're in. We're one with them. And so they're not. They didn't receive it because it was for us. it's us and them both is going to be at the same time receive that promise, where we're going to, when Jesus comes as a second coming, when he takes all the believers up to himself. That's when that's going to take place. So, going on, I think. There it goes. Yeah. Chapter 12. So now we'll look at chapter 12 to try to cover this one. We'll see how far we can get with it. Verses 1 through 4, the author and finisher of faith. Verses 5 through 13, enduring chastening. Verses 14 to 17, peace with all men, which there's more into that than just that, but I just put that title on it. Verses 18 to 21, the unapproachable mountain. And then 22 to 24, the city of the living God. And then 25 to 29, the unmovable kingdom. So we'll start going through this step by step, going through that. Now looking at verses 1 through 4. And it says, I'm reading through the New King James. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. And then, of course, and you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. So that's verses 1 through 4. So as we look at that, verse 1 is the cloud of witnesses. And the cloud of witnesses are who? Chapter 11. That's the cloud of witnesses. These are the witnesses, the testimonies, the martyrs, because the Greek word refers to martyrs also. It's also translated martyrs. So there's martyrs that are testimonies to us. And so we have all these as examples of walking, what it is to walk by faith. And then when we look at that, I just put on here, witnesses see our daily walk. That is the witnesses today in the world that we're around. They see our daily walk. And the question is, what do they see? When they see us, what do they see? Do they see like what the people in the Old Testament saw with all these witnesses? Do they see that what the believers that suffer for the name of God and walked and obeyed his commandments as prophets and leaders and so forth? Is that what we're doing? Are we given that same example? Or are they seeing us practicing sin? Is that what they're seeing? Our focus needs to be on Jesus, and that's the main thing. Verse 2, looking to Jesus, the leader and example of faith. So if we want to know what is it to walk by faith, look at Jesus. Jesus is the perfect example. See, all these in chapter 11, these were examples of the faith of Jesus. They were just pictures of the faith of Jesus. That's where our focus is to be. No one faced the things that Jesus faced to the extent that he faced. And he was the perfect example to follow. So we need to keep our focus on Jesus. And verses 3 and 4, we have not dealt with resisting sin to the point of death. And that is so true. We're not taking sin that serious that we would sacrifice. Stop and think about that, how important that is. That's extremely important in our walk, is we're not resisting sin the way we probably ought to be. We probably look at certain sins as, well, that's not that bad. But we don't realize the damage we do to ourselves by allowing ourselves to continue in some particular sins that we may be practicing. So that, which takes us back to verse 1 as well. Therefore, he says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. So each of us have our own particular sin that easily besets us. It causes an issue. Do we know what it is? Do we really want to know what it is? And what are we doing about it? And then verses 5 through 13, which is dealing with chastening. So as you look at verse 5, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. Okay, so first of all, you got to be a son. So this is talking to those that are his children. Are we his children? Now, some of us might think that we are when we're not. There's some people that believe that they are the children of God when they're not. So, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then are you illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who correct us, and we pay them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chasten us, which seems best to them, but he, the Father, for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. That's an extremely important verse there. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight the path for your feet, so that what is lame may not be, but rather be healed. Okay, so that's kind of the context there of what it is to be chastened. Now, some of us have the wrong idea what chastening is. And I think that's important. I think that's something, let's have that as an after class discussion. Just make some note what you think chastening is. And we'll kind of look at that and what that may be. And so we'll kind of get what you think it is when you're chastised by the Lord. And when it's not a chastening from the Lord. So looking at these verses again. So verses 5 through 8, God corrects his children. He corrects his children. If you're not being corrected by God, so it's important that we understand what chastening of the Lord is. And when is God actually chastening? So if he's chastening us, if he's disciplining us, that means we're his children. But if he's not, then you're not his. So that's kind of like verses 5 through 8. 9 through 11, example of the fleshly fathers. That's what he kind of gives the example of. But that important verse there, which was verse 10, For they indeed for a few days chasten us as seems best to them, but he for the profit that we may be partakers of his holiness. So the chastening has to do with what? Our walking in holiness, being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. That's what the chastening is about. The chastening is not about, I was speeding and I got a speeding ticket. That's not chastening from the Lord. You broke a law, you pay the penalty. You get caught. That's not chastening from the Lord. But some people have that kind of thought in their mind that that's what chastening is. I don't want to go into that because I think we want to discuss that a little bit more at the after class thing. So that's verses 9 through 11. And then, of course, 12 through 13. When weak, lift hands to God in prayer and worship. See, we want to make sure that, verse 12 says, therefore strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. You're weak. Why? Why are you weak? What are you doing? And that could be, if you're being chastened by the Lord, you might go have the attitude, oh, poor me. Why me? You may come across that kind of thinking. And the verse 13 says, make straight paths for your feet. So if you're making straight path for you, that means you can do that. You can make straight paths for your feet. And a straight path is a straight line. You're following right down the straight line. You're not all over the place. You're not getting off the path, going over it. You're not wavering all over the place. You got a straight path that you can stay on focus and stay on course. You can do that. Is that what we're doing? Is that what our practice is? So, there's going to be times that we're weak, but where's our focus? See? Is our focus on God, on the Lord Jesus Christ? Is that where our focus is? Because there's going to be times we're going to go through things that we're going to be weak. We're going to experience some weaknesses from time to time. And the idea is, how do we approach that? And what are we doing about it? Now we come to verses 14 to 17, which I got peace with all men, but it's more than that. Verse 14 says, pursue peace with all and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking diligently lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up, cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterwards, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. And that's back in Genesis, Genesis chapter 27. We had covered that before when we was doing Genesis and what had happened with Jacob and Esau. So the idea, we're looking for peace, but yet the main thing is he's saying here in verse 14, pursue peace with all men and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Peace and holiness. This is extremely important. Are we seeking peace instead of arguing and fighting? Some people, they will argue at the drop of a hat. And that's not seeking peace. And this is the type of people we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be peace bearers. We're supposed to be a peaceful people. And you stop and walk the walk of Jesus Christ. It was a walk of peace. And we see the example through Jesus' life on that. He's the example. So peace and holiness. Holiness is extremely important. Separated unto God. Is our walk a walk separated unto God? And they said, and now I'm going back over these verses again, but looking diligently lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Now that's a completely different interpretation of what you're hearing about grace today. Grace is like a blanket. But he's saying here, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. You can fall short. Now, grace is favor. Are you in favor of God, in God's favor, or are you out of God's favor? So our faith, Bible faith, is extremely important. Our walk is extremely important because our walk reveals who we really are. We're going to see this a little bit more deeper when we get into James, because James really spells these things out a little bit more intense than what Hebrews is doing. So we're going to get into that a little bit deeper and what that is, what a walk of faith really. Of course, he gave us some things here. So lest there be any fornicator, or wait, I didn't finish verse 15. I'd say, looking diligently lest anyone shall fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Have you become defiled? This is bad. And are we allowing ourselves to go down that path? Are we allowing that bitterness that may spring up? What are we doing? We allowing that to grow, that bitterness to grow? We need to do something about it, because if it don't, many become defiled by it. And then he goes into, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau. So he's using Esau as an example. And so as Esau is an example, so if you become like this, many become defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau. And what happened with Esau? After it went so far, what happened? He could not come back. There was no fixing of the problem. Once you've already rejected, of course, that takes you clear back to Hebrews 6. Remember that? I have to go back there. The verse. For it is impossible for those who once were enlightened. That's 6:4 through 6. So that kind of falls into that category. So we have to be careful that we're not allowing ourselves, because what it's doing is, that doesn't mean you lost salvation. What it's really bringing about is you never had it. See, that's the difference. It's not a works program to where you have to do this to keep it. No, this is what those that are born again will do. They will endure to the end. You'll have some pitfalls. Believers have pitfalls, yes. We may backslide, but we come back. We have those pitfalls. But what he's talking about is when these are the ones that just go way over beyond. It's like they go into a state of apostasy, is what they've done. And that's what he's talking about here. So we've got to be very careful in allowing ourselves to get that far gone, because what it's doing is revealing your heart, the true heart. That's what it's doing. And you know what the problem is? Our heart is deceitful and wicked. So now we're looking at verses 14 through 17, and what I put in, I highlighted, unholy living prevents one from seeing the Lord. Unholy living. You can't see the Lord in an unholy living. Now you can look at that in different ways. And that is, and I put in there, the scene has to do with open eyes, with your eyes open. And this can, you can apply this in different ways. But is he meaning that you will never see the Lord if you're not walking in holiness? Is that what he means? That could be. That could be what he means. Because every believer is to walk a holy walk. So seeing the Lord, the more we grow in a relationship, the more we see Jesus. And the more we see the Father. We see the Father and Son. We start to see them more in our spiritual growth. We're getting to know them. They're revealing themselves to us as we walk in this holy walk, a walk separated in a relationship with him. Now we got verses 18 to 21. And I got on here the unapproachable mountain, which it kind of is approachable, but you got to be careful if you approach it because you don't want to touch it. So that's kind of why I put it unapproachable. So verse 18, for you have not come to the mountain that may be touched, and that burns with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of the word, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. Wow. For they could not endure what was commanded. And if so much as a beast touched a mountain, it should be stoned or thrust through with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. So that's talking about Mount Sinai. And that's when the Lord spoke to them out of the mountain. And you go back and look at that in Exodus. That's what he's talking about Exodus chapters 19 and 20. That's is the area in what you're talking about at Mount Sinai. And they had to be cleansed before this can even take place. But notice that in verse 19 it's, and the sound of the trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. Wow. Verse 20, for they could not endure what was commanded. So that tells us there, can you keep the law of Moses to the letter? No, it's telling you no. They could not endure what was commanded. And therefore nobody is justified by faith. Nobody kept the law of Moses to the letter if you go by that direction. See, that's the idea that he's bringing out here. So it was the Mosaic law. If you break it, the penalties. Just at this mountain, if so much as a beast would touch the mountain, it would be stoned or thrust through with an arrow. It was very serious. And Moses was exceedingly afraid and trembling. That's how frightening it was. So do you want to go the way of the Mosaic law? Because that's what you get to face if you break it. But look at the flip side. It had to do with the heart condition of the people. So we have in the New Testament where people did keep the law. Zacharias and Elizabeth, for example, they were blameless. How can anybody be counted blameless? Faith. Faith. A heart for God. That's the only way. That's how it works. That's the whole principle. Is already faith goes all the way through the Bible, even under the law. It's faith. The law could not save you. It was faith that saved us. It's always been faith. And a lot of people miss that. So, verses 18 through 21, what did I put there? We are not approaching a mountain we cannot endure what is spoken. See, we're not approaching that mountain. That's not the mountain we're approaching. And that's what he goes into the next verses 22 through 24. And it says there, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. He's not talking about the physical Jerusalem that's over in Israel today. He's talking about what? The heavenly Jerusalem. To an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of the just men made complete, to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. So now we are approaching the city, the heavenly Jerusalem. That's what we're facing. We're not looking for a place on earth. It's the new Jerusalem. It's the heavenly Jerusalem. That's what we're looking for. And we saw that that's what Abraham was looking for. His thoughts was where? The heavenly Jerusalem. We went through that, if you recall. We went back and I showed you how it was leading up to this. That's where the thought process was. It's always been by faith, believing God. It's always been that clear through. So, verse 22, we are approaching the heavenly city of the living God. That's verses 22 to 24. And of course, 25 through 29, the unmovable kingdom. So, we'll read that real quick. So then we'll start chapter 13 next time. See that you do not refuse him who speaks, for if he did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has appointed, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this, yet once more, indicating the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptable with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. So the kingdom we're looking to is unshakable. This world's kingdom, they're going to shake. And they're going to shake away. They're not going to stand. They can't stand. But we are in the unmovable kingdom. That's why we're able to stand today, because we're in the unmovable kingdom. We're part of that unmovable kingdom. We're not part of this world. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. Remember Jesus said that? You're in the world, but you're not of the world. So that's why we can be in that unshakable kingdom. So I'm going to wrap that up real quick there. So we serve God acceptable in an unmovable kingdom. So we may serve God acceptable with reverence and godly fear. So we need a godly fear. And believers need to have that godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire. So how do you want to meet him? A loving God or a consuming fire? Which way would you prefer? Okay, so our time is up on that, so I'll stop that now.